Vážení diváci Britských listů, dnes máme jako svého hosta analytika z vídeňské poradenské společnosti Marcuse Howema a budeme se bavit o tom, že nejenom v Čechách přicházíme o politické lídry v těch dnech, ale také v sousedním Rakousku. Marcus, welcome. Without any further ado, before I ask you what is actually happening and what led to the downfall of Sebastian Kurz, can you briefly tell us where did he stand politically?
Well, Sebastian Kurz is in many respects a figure who is not ideological. At the very least, he went on a political journey through his career. So he started off on the liberal conservative side of his party, the People's Party, the ÖVP. And over time, he built up a personal profile. He was young. He saw that there was a need for change in what he viewed as an old, crusty party that was in secular decline. And he developed his personal profile, kind of talking about issues like migration and integration. At the time, this was more moderate in discourse. But as a result of the asylum crisis in 2015, the far-right Freedom Party began to make a lot of inroads and were preparing themselves for government on this populist message. And Kurz saw here an opportunity to shift to the right. And in shifting to the right, he essentially had to collapse the grand coalition that the ÖVP had with the Social Democrats at the time, when it was led by a moderate sort of centrist, and he in effect conspired to topple the leader of the party and took over and sold himself as the new hope who was going to take the party to the right on some issues while still remaining anchored in the establishment. And so as a result of that, he touched on a wide range of themes. Some of them are liberal in nature, but some of them more mainstream, more within the European establishment mainstream.
Where would you rank him in terms of let's say, a liberal populist in the V4 countries, also in relation to the Czech Republic? Because I can sense some of the let's say similarities, for example, to the outgoing Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, who is also very often described as the ideology, without any ideology, let's say.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, there are a great many similarities between Kurz and his counterparts in the V4. I think ultimately he didn't go as far, partly because he was constrained by Austria's institutions, partly perhaps because he didn't want to. Maybe we have to give him the benefit of the doubt on this point. But where there are similarities are on a number of points. The first of which is the populist platform, and in effect using this as a way to mobilize the vote. But it's not really ideologically motivated populism. It's in a sense opportunistic. It's to be electorally competitive. The next point is that he developed, which in his party, the People's Party at the time, was very novel, this very centralized form of messaging, message control, as they called it, this repetitive messaging, repeating the same populist themes over and over and over. And this was sustained in effect through a coalition of interests which involved key tabloid agencies who in effect were co-opted through various means. So that's another important part of it. There's another sense in which there's this unilateralist majoritarian way of governing, which doesn't necessarily mean that you need a majority. You just act as if you have a majority and that the people are behind you. And in effect, using that to if not capture, then certainly influence the character of institutions. And in particular, Sebastian Kurz, which was unusual in Austria's political history, had very little time for parliament. Parliament for him wasn't so much a forum for debate, so much as an extension of the government. So in a sense, there was this blurring of the lines between the government and the state. and seeing himself very much as part of that.
But you describe populism as a distraction technique. Would that be something that Sebastian Kurz was deliberately exploiting, let's say, or was it, as you also mentioned, more of an opportunistic approach?
Whenever he had problems domestically, for example, in the last 6 months or more, there was the whole issue with these corruption investigations into people around Kurz and so on and so forth. And whenever there was an escalation in that situation, Kurz would very often go abroad and create some drama abroad. So, for example, he went to Israel with the Danish Prime Minister to discuss the opening of a vaccine development center in Austria during the middle of the pandemic. Then we had the issue with, for example, vaccine distribution, and making a big fuss about this on the European stage, and didn't really come to any avail, but it was a useful distraction while he had problems at home. Then there was also the procurement or the proposed procurement of Sputnik vaccines, which again came to nothing. But there are a lot of these publicity stunts which are a form of tactics. So Kurz is a very good tactician, and he exercises tactics primarily through communications. But where there is lacking is a strategy, a strategy to really address, for example, the long-term impact of the pandemic on the economy and what that means for working, what that also means for the budget, who's going to pay for the pandemic. And these are questions that Kurz did not really address, and all the while engaged in various publicity stunts in effect to shore up his popularity with the electorate.
Did Kurz also, Sebastian Kurz, did he also use this tactique to sort of distract attention from perhaps his controversial moves when it came to political appointments with business
Yes, this is the suspicion. And the situation with Kurz has been that of these corruption investigations into his inner circle and into his the first coalition that he led with the far-right Freedom Party, they were in effect trying to carve up the political system in order to lock out the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats had been a quasi-institutional presence for many decades. And one of the objectives of Kurz was to lock them out of the picture. And as part of doing that, you have various state-owned or linked enterprises in Austria. And Kurz, together with the Freedom Party at the time, was carving up those positions to loyalists. And as we saw in the investigations, in some cases, those were political appointments of people who weren't qualified for the roles. One of the suspicions in the investigations is that members of that government were systematically bribed by the gambling industry in Austria, which is a monopoly, but with private interests behind it. And then there's also been this other aspect of the media, and in effect buying off media moguls allegedly, in exchange for which the government secures favorable coverage and is able to influence public discourse. And then he also had around him this sort of network of business interests, which included various oligarchs, in effect, Austrian oligarchs, or at least very wealthy people, some of whom were old players, some of whom were newer ones. And there's a question of to what extent there might have been wrongdoing in those circles. And I think what we see now is only really the tip of the iceberg with respect to the business interests of the Kurz system, as it's called here.
It's listening to you. It seems to me that there's another parallel emerging that I would highlight, and that I would describe as a political erasing of social democracy from the region, or even marginalizing it, or both, really. Would you agree with me, or do you think this is just simply a result of a competition in politics?
It is certainly the case, and it's quite well documented that Kurz was very tired of these grand coalitions with the Social Democrats and thought that the People's Party needed to make a new start with him at the helm. And this, in as far as he has a strategy, a long-term vision, is it, because he essentially wanted to lock the Social Democrats out of the system, and he was prepared to enter into coalition with whichever party he needed to in order to secure a majority. So that started with the far-right Freedom Party, and then later it moved on to the Greens. It's a lot of this that I think Kurz has this suspicion towards the Social Democrats, and this suspicion is quite deeply rooted within Austrian politics, because the People's Party and the Social Democrats in the 1920s, 1930s were bitter enemies. This led then to totalitarianism, and then after World War II, they needed to, in effect, work together in order to ensure the viability of the Austrian state. However, they had been enemies once, and they had once shed blood. So there was very much this sense that the two parties, in carving up the system between themselves in the post-war period, were in a sense acting as a check and a balance on each other, as a form of control. And I think that Kurz, in a way, is an evolved version of the People's Party part of that equation. So he has that deep suspicion towards them, and had a negative experience himself with them when he was a minister in the Grand Coalition. So that has been his primary objective. So the difference being with the Czech Republic, of course, that the Social Democrats weren't co-opted as they were by Babiš. They weren't co-opted in Austria by Kurz. He very much wanted them out of the game entirely.
Since we already touched upon the Green Party in Austria, and if I may allude to Czech politics one more time, Czech major populist politicians such as Miloš Zeman or Andrej Babiš, they very frequently express climate-skeptic views, or even criticize European Union or Brussels, as they say in general, on grounds of climate-related policies. And I have been wondering, would you say that Sebastian Kurz had to respect Austrian Green Party as a major political force, or do you think he would also perhaps in some respects play the criticism of green policies in order to, let's say, make alliances with across the region with the populist politicians, such as the Czech ones, but also the Hungarian?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, Austria has quite a long tradition now of developing renewable power. So Austria was an early mover in this respect with regard to hydropower in the 1990s. Nuclear power was already well off the table by the end of the 1970s. So there is this ecological movement that is quite deeply rooted in Austrian society as well as the political system. And the People's Party does reflect that to some extent. However, on some issues, it's more ambivalent, and Kurz has been particularly ambivalent. So although they have been in coalition with the Greens and have been developing sort of policies that could be described as pioneering, you know, sort of various taxes and making national public transport more affordable, etc., etc. On other issues, he regurgitates these kind of old climate skeptic sort of discourse. So, for example, he was repeating this mantra that it's that climate change policy is a trade-off between the economy and the environment. But this is something that was already, this belongs way back in the 1980s, 1990s. So in that sense, I think he's trying to reach out to this more right-wing part of the spectrum, and some of it also in the industrial sector, who don't want to go too far on climate policy.
Well, this is still one aspect that's quite different from the Czech politics, where the public environmental debate is at a very low level, I would say. But since we're running out of time, maybe very quick last question, very briefly. What would be your prediction for the immediate future?
It's a very open question. It's the picture is one of uncertainty. The question really is what will happen to Kurz. He has powerful actors in his party, these regional governors who are increasingly against him. The question in Austria now is whether Kurz will be able to return as a Spitzenkandidat and become chancellor again. At the moment, that's looking less likely because these corruption investigations are developing and new revelations are always coming out. So the question is whether he would then be able to, if there were new elections, would he run as for chancellor with a corruption charge and a potential conviction hanging over him? That's the big question for his party. And it also means that the potential coalition partners are very limited, because it would be electoral suicide to say we will enter into a coalition with the chancellor who is facing criminal charges. So the picture is a colourful one. The opposition are still not competitive, so we'll have to see in the next 6 months how things develop, whether the Green People's Party government holds together.
Thank you very much. Vážení diváci, děkuji za pozornost a těším se na shledanou.